live debate. Intelligence².com.
Yeah, I'm going to show a lot of pictures, so my co-panelists are going to have really severe neck problems at the end of this, looking round. One of the things I'm always struck by is the way that riding a bike is such a childlike pleasure. Even now in my dreary middle age, if I'm cycling through Hyde Park, it takes me right back to the freedom that my first ever bike promised, especially if I'm doing something else which in my skinny-legged adolescence seemed absolutely inconceivably shaming, that is to say, wearing shorts. I'm sure many of you know the Australian Les Murray's poem, The Dream of Wearing Shorts Forever, shorts being a symbol for him of democratic Australianness. But for me, in this bicycling context, those shorts are a symbol of the bare-legged, unself-conscious freedoms of childhood. And when you get a bike as a child, it's not just a vehicle, it's a way of being transported, given a passport to a wider world, being able to pass almost to the other side of the mirror. And here we have documentary proof of that in the form of one of Helen Levitt's classic New York pictures from about 1940, this one. It's that great thing that she does in all of those pictures, not just showing children, but somehow conveying what it's like to be in a child's head, which for a medium such as photography, which is wedded to the depiction of the external world, is a quite remarkable thing to do. Oh, I should say there's a quiz element in my presentation, so I hope your fingers are on your buzzers. Intelligence², they've generously come up with a prize. Here is the prize. It's a quite incredible resourcefulness on their part. That sense of adventure never quite wears off. It turns out that a bike can take you to all sorts of unusual places, even when you've grown up like this fellow, and this fellow is... Correct. Do contact me afterwards to pick up your prize. Yeah, Rainer Banham, the great architecture critic and writer. And if you bear that image in mind, we'll come back to it, actually. But of course, the great thing about a bike is that you don't just use it to get around. It's also a kind of shopping trolley, a great way of carrying not just human beings, but their stuff, as this famous picture of Cartier-Bresson's reminds us. I think Will agree with me about this. Being tall, getting in and out of cars is a really awful, horrible maneuver that we have to do. Whereas, of course, getting on and off a bike is incredibly easy, and you can, although it's starting to not be true in London, it's generally quite easy to park a bike, whereas I mean, I'm absolutely incapable of parking in a car. The great thing about cycling is that as soon as you feel sleepy, you can just throw down the bike and go straight to sleep, whether you're on this country road or if you're in Central Park in New York. This is one of a series of pictures by Todd Papageorge from his series Passing Through Eden, pictures of Central Park. It's a great picture, this, but it's rather strange. There's a suggestion that what began as a bike ride has ended up as a not entirely successful parachute jump. But yeah, parking is not an issue with a bike, whether you're on your own like this guy or whether you happen to have the good fortune to be with a friend. So here we are, Todd Papageorge in this urban Eden of New York, Central Park. But a bike is not just a romantic accessory, it's also in certain conditions, as this famous photograph by Li Hung-shing demonstrates, it's a very useful way of avoiding the might of the state. This is Beijing, 1989, just after the storming of Tiananmen Square. This is a history not just of photographs of people, not just a history of people who've taken photographs of bikes, it's also a sort of history of the many uses of the bicycle. here's a picture by the Magnum photographer Bruno Barbi, which suggests, amazingly, that you can also swim with a bicycle. Or you can try to fly with it, as in this early photograph by Jacques-Henri Lartigue. It's not quite as implausible as it looks, since I'm sure many of you know that the first successful manned flight was made by Orville and Wilbur Wright, who of course made their money running a bicycle company, selling, renting, and building bikes. But very briefly, let's not forget that cycling is dangerous, as the great Mexican photographer of disasters, Enrique Metanides, reminds us here. I guess the moral of this picture is wear your helmet. But we don't want to get too bogged down, as Patrick was saying, in efficiency and safety, because that would go against the whole short-trousered, childlike freedom that we first fell in love with. I can see the stylistic attraction of couriers all decked out in what Martin Amis calls their urban scuba wear. But having to make concessions about what you wear does somewhat limit the appeal of the bike. One of the objections that members of the taxi-taking classes make to cycling is that you can't dress glamorously, to which I offer this photograph by the Brazilian photographer Otto Stupakov as evidence to the contrary. It's actually quite ties in quite nicely with the picture Bella showed. I mean, I think this one, it's almost as if there'd been a competition to design the least practical garment for cycling, one that could get tangled up equally easily in the chain and the wheels, precisely in order to refute the anti-glamour argument. And there's scope for glamour even in the harshest environment, the kind of place where we last saw old Rayner Banham cutting a kind of bearded anti-dash on his proto Brompton. Because in fact, it turns out that the most cycling-friendly place on earth, where practically every one of its citizens has a bike and where no one even bothers locking them up, is to be found in a landscape exactly like this in the temporary city of Black Rock, in the utterly flat Nevada desert, home of the annual Burning Man Festival, which is known as a kind of big freak out, but it's also a kind of cycling festival, really. And I think it's fair to say that people really don't dress boringly or functionally at all, and we'll see some of the people here at Burning Man. And also the definition of what constitutes a bicycle ends up getting quite radically extended to include some of these vehicles or bicycles, particularly like this one. You've got this sort of, I don't know, it's like Boadicea, queen of the desert, although I suppose if you were being incredibly pedantic about it, you could say that she's disqualified because it's a tricycle, not a bicycle. There's all sorts of incredible bicycles on display there. This is perhaps the most elaborate one of all, not entirely practical in London, of course, but... and then you've got this remarkable contraption, gives you a very, very good view, and this great sort of thing for the desert. Quite often in... I've really wanted to illustrate this next person. When you're in Burning Man at night, you see this flaming figure cycling around, as in the picture on your top right. And these three pictures, they really show how it's done. So the actual human guy it's a sort of tandem, and he sort of drags around this flaming figure. But at night, it's really very, very effective, and you only see the flaming figure. But I want to come back to photography as opposed to photographs of interesting bikes. I think Alex Webb and Gary Winogrand speak for all street photographers when they say that their method of work really just involves walking. And that's the great disadvantage of cycling, namely that you can't take photographs while you're doing it. But weirdly, I think that bicycles in some photographs sort of stand in for this drifting, wandering, solitary, shadowy figure, the street photographer waiting in a state of highly alert patience for the moments when life arranges itself in those perfectly symmetrical, sometimes plausibly serendipitous ways that make for great photographs, as in this one by Alex Webb himself, where the bespoke wheel is echoed by that weird sniper-like grill in the bridge that has the surfer in its crosshairs. In a way, being on a bike, I think, gives the rest of us the chance to see the world as a street photographer does, but without all the boring waiting around, without the bother and tedium of lugging around a camera and worrying about depth of field and exposure and so on, as is illustrated, I think, so brilliantly in this great picture by Joel Meyerowitz. I mean, how much is there going on in this picture? But I think it's great the way that the cyclist sort of stands as a surrogate both of Meyerowitz himself and as a kind of backward-glancing representative of our own baffled amazement that life can contrive itself into these wonderful patterns. So this was going to be a talk about cycling, photography, and romance, and I just want to end very quickly by showing you one of my favorite photographs of all time. I think it's a supremely romantic picture. It's a great bike picture, even if strictly speaking, I suppose, it's a walking picture rather than a cycling picture. It's by Robert Capa, of course. And Capa's friend Cartier-Bresson said that one of the remarkable things about photography was that you could reconfigure the world totally just by shifting a few inches to the left or a few degrees to the right, which this picture illustrates perfectly, because it turns out that the picture is not telling the whole story, as an explanatory caption in one of the catalogues of Capa's work makes clear. This is the extended caption of this lovely romantic image. Near Nicosia, Sicily, July the 28th, 1943. An Italian soldier straggling behind a column of his captured comrades as they march off to a POW camp. Who said the bicycle never lied? Thank you.